So hello and welcome everybody to this fireside conversation with Dr. Hennie Geldenhuys on applied ethics in transpersonal coaching. I'm going to say a few words to bring us together into the shared space around our campfire. And then I will introduce our conversation partner today, and then we'll get into some questions which Hennie and I have prepared for today's sessions. But as we explore these questions on ethics related to coaching, and that would just as well apply to any other form of facilitating or therapy, we'll welcome questions from any of you. So Dr. Hennie Geldenhuys is a certified transpersonal coach, medical doctor, and clinical researcher. He has a passion for applied ethics, particularly in the fields of transpersonal coaching, transpersonal research, and medical research. He regularly conducts workshops in applied ethics and is the chair of the Aleph Trust Research Ethics Panel. Hennie lives in a small town in the Western Cape region of South Africa, nestled among the mountains and the unique fynbos biome. Hennie, say hello.
Hello.
Good to have you with us in the space again. You and I and those in the live session know you well. So this introduction is for those watching the recording later who don't know you as well yet. Let's move along. I've got a first question for Hennie, just to get the conversation started. So Hennie, ethics seems an elusive concept. What is it? And are there any ethical frameworks that are useful for coaches?
Yes, well, it's good to be here and to talk about a topic that is really important to each of us. Yes, ethics can be very abstract. It can be very conceptual. That's certainly not my intent today. I don't consider myself an academic ethicist. I consider myself a street ethicist, in the sense that what's important to me is what matters in our practice, what matters in real life. And I'm hoping that's how we can approach ethics today. I mean, ultimately, ethics is about doing the right thing. It's about ways of approaching what is right, what is wrong, what is better, what is not best practice. Already there's a tension there, because we know that real life doesn't work like that. There are plenty of gray areas in life. And here we are trying to impose a sort of a binary yes, no, right, wrong onto this very gray world. And so ethics, in my mind, is about how we approach that, how we try and set up systems and ways of thinking around that. There are numerous models of ethics, and I really don't want to get lost in that today. I could tell you about all sorts of different frameworks, but maybe not today. There are two particular approaches that I think are relevant to us as transpersonal practitioners. The one is the so-called principle-based approach to ethics, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about that in a while. The other is an interesting distinction that we don't often hear, and that's the difference between something called active ethics and passive ethics. And I think that's really relevant to us. Let me explain what that means. Active ethics is more rule-based, right? It's about things that we should not do, actions or behaviors that we should not do. That's active ethics, which in a way is a little easier because we can just sort of set down the rules. For example, we know that we don't break confidentiality or privacy. We don't speak about private content from a session with other members of the public, right? Or we don't enter into an inappropriate relationship with our client. So those are examples of active-based ethics. Perhaps even more important for us are passive ethics. So passive ethics refers to the things that we do, to the things that we do to cultivate our own practice, our own way of being, our own way of working in a way that we cultivate characteristics in ourselves that lead to ethical practice. So it's the things that we do and the things that we develop in ourselves, but also in the system around us as a profession, that lead to ethics. And to me, actually, that sort of thing is more important than just saying, don't do this, don't do that. That in a nutshell is what I think is important about ethics. Yeah. And I'm wondering, Johan, can I say a little bit more about principle-based ethics?
You go ahead, Hennie. We'd love to hear about that.
Good. Thank you. Principle-based ethics is one of the approaches to ethics. It's a very prevalent approach to ethics in modern times, because what principle-based ethics says is that there are certain universal principles or values that are common to all people, no matter where you find yourself and what culture you are. And certain principles are always at play. And if we apply those principles or follow those values, then our practice will be ethical. There are different values of those. Now, recognizing that very often these values or these principles might be in conflict, right? So we want to do what's in the best interest of our participant, but perhaps in extreme cases in doing so, we need to break confidentiality for some reason. So then the one principle of autonomy would be in conflict with the principle of beneficence. Okay. So it's about the process of weighing up those different values or principles and coming to the best possible decision that we can under the circumstances. There are many code-based guidelines out there, and they're all based on this approach of principle-based ethics. Unfortunately, transpersonal coaching doesn't yet have a unique set of ethical codes. Maybe we should. But we can borrow from other therapeutic traditions. For example, some of the more well-known codes of practice would be from the British British Psychological Society, or the APA, the American Psychology Association, and many others. Here are some of the principles that one might find in those guidelines. So think about how this would apply to transpersonal coaching. I'll throw out some examples as I go along, and I would love to hear from you if you can think of some applications or examples. One of the first principles is the principle of respect for our client, or autonomy. So autonomy says that the client has a right to follow their own process. They have a right to make their own decisions. And so things like informed consent is important to us, but also we respect our client's process so that we don't intrude on their process. It's their process, it's not our process. It's not our drama to play out in the coaching space, it's their space in which to play. And so we don't impose our rigid ways of working onto our client. We hold that space for them to follow their own process. We don't force them into a certain way of working just because, well, that's the way I work. Autonomy in our context means respecting that space and respecting that process. It also leads to things like privacy and confidentiality. So we do our best not to divulge secrets or things that our client wouldn't want others to know. We respect that, of course. That's part of autonomy. Here are some other principles. Beneficence. You might hear about that. Beneficence comes from the Latin word bene, which means good. So beneficence literally means to do good. We do good by our client. Everything that we do in the best interest of our client. It revolves around the client, client-centered coaching. It also means that we make sure that we are able to service our client properly. So competency, training, ongoing practice becomes important for the principle of beneficence. There's the principle of non-maleficence, right? These are fancy sounding words, but non-maleficence simply means we do no harm. Think about that. We do no harm. In a while, I hope we're going to talk about some things that are unique to transpersonal coaching, some of which might represent harm. But we don't want to do anything that actually puts our client in a worse position than they were just because of the coaching process. And we'll come to some examples around that. Okay. Other principles that are relevant to us, things like authenticity, or sometimes it's called veracity, which means that we stay true to ourselves, we stay true to our profession, we stay true to our morality. We don't get sidetracked. We keep checking ourselves to make sure that we are staying true to our values or principles as transpersonal coaches. There's the principle of justice, for example, or fairness. Now, maybe this is obvious, but we have to state it. We don't judge our clients. We don't treat them differently because of their race, because of their gender, because of where they are in the world. Having said that, sometimes that's easier said than done, because as we'll keep recognizing today, we bring into the coaching space our being, our triggers, our biases. Those are unavoidable. And so it's easy to say, yes, well, don't bring your biases because that's unethical. But my question would be, how do you even know that you're biased? And so hopefully later today, we'll talk about ways that we can cultivate an attitude or a practice that tries to prevent some of these errors that we might make. Does that make sense, Johan, so far?
Hennie, this makes lots of sense. And it just reminds me of so many things that have been implicit in our way of working that we don't often talk about, because these are what feels to me to be naturally occurring ways of being and considerations that transpersonal coaches use. Yeah. So it's great that we're kind of pinpointing exactly what these considerations are and should be. But I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into the applied domain of what we do as transpersonal coaches and facilitators. So, if we think about our ways of working, with the held space being a central way in which we connect with clients to establish rapport and to facilitate expanded states of consciousness where both practitioner and client co-create a field in which we feel safe, we feel understood, and we feel it's okay to experience different perceptions and to connect deeply with the body, and perhaps even beyond the body, to other images, symbols, and ideas that might be part of one's experience of self. So expanded states of consciousness is what I'm pointing to. Mm. And so in the held space involving expanded states of consciousness, how do we bring ethics into that discussion? Where are ethics in this? How do we apply ethics? There's a whole multitude of questions. Can I just pile that onto you, Hennie?
Yes, pile along.
Yeah. Thank you.
Add to the pile. Yes. Well, I mean, what you're actually asking is, might there be some things unique to transpersonal coaching that pose particular ethical challenges? My answer is yes, absolutely. And we need to think about how this applies to us specifically. Now, there are a number of things that we can unpack here, right? What are some things that I think might be unique from an ethical perspective? Well, it's like you are saying, Johan, we work with this very special sacrosanct space that we call the held space. Within this space, special things happen, right? There's this energetic transfer. There's what we put into this space. There's what the client puts into this space. We talk about holding this space through expanded states of consciousness. We talk about using our intuition, using our insight. Now, these are important tools for us, okay? But each one brings along some ethical pitfalls. So we could perhaps start talking about expanded states of consciousness. We could perhaps talk about that energetic transfer and ethical implications around that. We could perhaps talk about intuition. So lots to talk about here, exciting stuff. But let's start off just because. Let's talk about so-called expanded states of consciousness. In some ways, our bread and butter as transpersonal coaches, isn't it? All right. But now, there's this notion, I think somewhat naively, that so-called altered states of consciousness, as opposed to what we might call expanded states of consciousness, that all altered states of consciousness are benign. They're all good. There's nothing that can go wrong. Is that true, though? Is there absolutely no risk involved to expanded or altered states of consciousness? What do you think? If one looks at the literature, you come to realize that maybe that's not entirely true. So even something like mindfulness meditation, for example, there have been potential risks identified. So we might be talking about things like bringing overwhelming unconscious material to consciousness for which our client is not yet ready. And so they might experience states of anxiety, the so-called affect states like depression or hyperarousal, or there might be traumatic memories that surface for which they are not quite ready for. There have even been examples of things like activation of psychotic states in certain people. These might be uncommon, but they are always a risk in the background, isn't it? So when we do work with these expanded states of consciousness, ethics would say that we consider all these potential risks and we prepare ourselves for them. So here are a couple of things that I've thought of. Maybe you can think of more. Things that we might need to do to make sure that we use expanded states of consciousness ethically. So we need to be trained properly, don't we? Which means that we need to have gone through some training opportunity, like a training course, in which we talk a lot about expanded states of consciousness and ways of facilitating that. And we have practiced it. Which brings me to my second point. Not only have we practiced it with others and with clients, but we've practiced it within ourselves. I don't think that we can, as coaches, ethically facilitate expanded states of consciousness if we haven't experienced it ourselves. So it comes to our integral practice, our ongoing practice. But now also it's about the nature of the expanded state of consciousness. If you are not trained for deeper altered states of consciousness, like, for example, deep hypnosis, regression therapy, use of psychedelics, if that's not within your training or your scope of practice, then I would suggest avoid it. Don't do it because you're not competent in that. You're posing a risk if you use it irresponsibly. Maybe you are trained and you can integrate that into your practice, but if not, stick to what you have been trained in. For example, and very much sort of in our tradition, we use this special state called open awareness. I happen to think that open awareness is a safe and ethical example of an expanded state of consciousness because it's inclusive. It doesn't suppress a particular faculty. It doesn't aim to take our client deep, whatever that might mean. And it doesn't seek to dissociate irresponsibly. It's a very inclusive, warm, expanded state of consciousness. And also bearing in mind that most of our best work as coaches, we do with a very light, expanded or altered state of consciousness. We don't need to go for the big work guns often. And bearing in mind that those big guns are probably the ones that might represent risk. So those are my thoughts around the ethical use of expanded states of consciousness. I would like to go on and talk about that sort of energetic transfer next, but I mean, Javon, anyone else? I mean, any thoughts around that?
I certainly welcome thoughts, comments, or questions from anybody else. But I appreciate at this moment, Hennie, how you are differentiating expanded states of consciousness. And I'm particularly interested in, setting aside the quality of one's state in a gentle or soft expanded state of consciousness versus an altered state of consciousness. And I know that many practitioners use expanded and altered interchangeably, but I think it's important in transpersonal coaching that we do differentiate that an expanded state of consciousness facilitated through a gentle, client-centered, open awareness-based process enables those clients to just get above the horizon line of their present state so that they can see that bigger picture and feel more of what's alive within themselves while feeling safe, grounded, centered. So we don't take them further. So I appreciate that you emphasized it's not about going too deep or too far out for that matter. It's just about helping the client to get above or go below their normal frame of reference so that they can tune into that other level of creativity and resourcefulness that's available to them, but was perhaps out of reach. And then some of these more robust, altered states of consciousness do have their time and place in certain sets and settings, but aren't generally what we make use of in the transpersonal coaching relationship. However, it's interesting to me how so many clients that have had mind-blowing experiences through encounters at retreats or psychedelic experiences or spontaneously or otherwise end up being our clients because they're trying to process those experiences, make sense, and integrate them into their lives. And I find there that the light, open awareness state helps them to connect to what is meaningful and relevant from those more robust altered states, to bring that into the conversation, to really be able to process and make sense of it. And this is one of the really valuable contributions that transpersonal coaching is bringing to the field, that we can help people that have had profound, perhaps even transformative experiences to process that in a state that is very close to their ordinary way of experiencing themselves, and eventually makes that non-ordinary state ordinary. And I think, ethics is going to remain truly, truly important. I don't know, Hennie, if that has diverted from your thread or if you have a follow-up on that before we move on.
No, I think it's very relevant. Yes, and yes. So again, it comes back to what we were saying. It's more about what we do and how we do than what we shouldn't do. In my mind, that's what ethics is about. How we use these beautiful and potent tools that we have at our disposal as coaches in the best service of our client. And what does that mean? So yes, I think what you are saying is very relevant. It latches on nicely to this idea about this held space. So let's talk about that, because this is the medium in which we work, the so-called held space, which is often also, it's a numinous concept, isn't it? It's sort of very abstract. I mean, the held space is like the container. It's like I suppose, the metaphor that we use for the interaction, for the engagement between coach and client. Well, not only coach and client, but everyone else and everything else, anything that is relevant to the coaching session is within that space. But now as transpersonal coaches, we have a particular sensitivity towards what we put into that space and what the client brings into that space, compared, for example, to more conventional psychotherapeutic traditions, which tend to, and I'm generalizing here, my apologies, but they tend to be more objective in their stance, and they tend to be slightly more analytical. Maybe that's too much of a generalization, but you know what I mean. In transpersonal coaching, we recognize, we appreciate that the boundaries are perhaps less rigid. There should be boundaries, but perhaps the boundaries are less rigid. There's more of us and there's more of the client because we are talking about non-conscious material that enters that space. What are the ethical implications about that energetic transfer? Call it what you may, soul transfer, energy transfer. There's a whole lot of that going on. There are some concepts that are important to us. For example, transference and countertransference. Transference and countertransference take on a special upgraded meaning for us as transpersonal coaches because of this energetic transfer. Transference traditionally is when the client projects onto us or projects into the coaching space. For example, they are having relationship problems. I'm having problems with my male partner. I'm a male coach. And so maybe they, in a way, unconsciously transfer that onto me as the coach. Countertransference is when I, as the coach, react to that material, bearing in mind that trigger, that reaction might be unconscious. So my client is telling me about a traumatic childhood experience. I also had a traumatic childhood experience. It touches me deeply. Maybe it touches me deeply in a good way if I've done the work. If I haven't, maybe it touches me in an unresourceful way. What do I start doing as the coach if I don't know about this? I start putting my own material into the coaching space, maybe in what I say, maybe in what I do, in how I am in the coaching space, because I'm triggered. I've sort of lost my open awareness here. Maybe it forces me to try and lead the client into a certain direction, and so it diminishes their autonomy because I'm triggered. I don't think transference and countertransference can be avoided. People who say we should avoid it and make it a sort of an ethical rule, I think are being naive. Let's be honest, all of us are triggered in some way or another. But I suppose it's in how we manage those triggers. And so to me, it comes down to having an inner awareness before the session, during the session, after the session. It's about doing the work. It's about doing the work on ourselves. We need to become comfortable with our own triggers and with our own biases. And we need to be aware of when that is happening. Not so that necessarily we can avoid it completely, because maybe transference and countertransference can be very useful if we use it effectively as coaches. But we should be careful about those non-conscious reactions that play part. Now, look, I think as transpersonal coaches, we are in a really good position to be able to do that. I've noticed that in other therapeutic traditions, they don't recognize this fact, because I think it's happening all the time in any helping professional relationship. There's this to and fro going on. At least we recognize it, and we train for it, we practice, and we're on the lookout for it. So I think that's important about the energetic transfer, things like transference, countertransference. There's a slightly, I want to talk about intuition and insight and the ethics of that next. But before I do that, there's a sort of an opposite side to this energy transfer, and then I'll stop talking for a while. But and that's the energy that, for want of a better word, reflects back into us. We as coaches need to look after ourselves, don't we? We can't do our job effectively if we are triggered so often in an unresourceful way by the coaching space that we become wounded. And so what I'm talking about here is how we protect ourselves, recognizing there's that intimate energetic transfer and really deep stuff that sometimes comes up in coaching sessions. How do we do that? Different ways for different coaches. You have to develop a system that works for you, but this is sort of proactive. It doesn't happen by accident. And so some examples that I've heard people mention would be things like preparing yourself for a coaching session, for example, through a short meditation or open awareness session. Maybe it's a ritual, something that activates those mechanisms, like, for example, lighting a candle or burning incense, or some somatic practice, some jumi that you do, for example, or whatever might be relevant to you before a session, after a session. Maybe for you, it's journaling. Maybe it's something that you bring to supervision, which we'll talk about just now as well. And so I think, good ethics is just as much about how we manage ourselves and even protect ourselves than it is about managing and protecting the coaching space. So those are some thoughts around that energetic transfer. I hope some of this makes sense and it resonates with some of you.
If anybody has a question for Hennie on this particular point, feel free to raise your hand. But Hennie, I think this is so important because this energetic transfer is happening whether we know it or not. So the more we can sense into the space and feel it occurring and respond resourcefully, perhaps even more wisely, to this occurrence, I think the less we might be affected in the session, but more importantly, the more presence we bring to the health space, and therefore the more value we bring to the client's experience potentially. So I think it's crucial that we recognize when we're triggered and have the skill available to us to reopen the aperture of awareness, to come back to being present when we've been triggered out of the present into a certain emotion, memory, combination of the two, or some other sensation or energetic shift that's occurring to us because of something the client said, did, or reminded us of. Each time we're triggered in that way, we need to be able to identify the trigger has occurred and have the skill to have elasticity in consciousness, bringing awareness back into the space, returning to being the container for self and client. That's, I think, a fundamental ethical consideration and skill for us. So I'm so glad you raised that, but I see Shara has a hand up. Love to hear from you, Shara.
Hi there. Hey, Hennie.
Hi.
Hi. Can you give an example of where transference and countertransference can actually be beneficial to the relationship or to the session? You mentioned that it can be beneficial. Can you just give some kind of an example just so I can get a sense? Thank you.
Sure. I mean, transference, countertransference tends to have a negative connotation. But if you think about it in terms of what the client brings and we can bring that is resourceful. So, for example, the client might receive some benefit from having a more objective view about something. So the client projects or transfers onto me some statement. For example, I'm useless, I'm incapable, I'm limited, I'm not clever, I can't do something. So the client is transferring that thought onto me, or into the coaching space. Or they might be transferring some notion like, there is no meaning in life. Life has no purpose. It's going nowhere. Don't you agree with me? They might say to you, the client might say to you, as if they're trying to co-opt you into that thought. Life has no meaning. You agree with me, don't you? That might be an example of transference. That's useful in the sense that now I, as the coach, can resourcefully manage that or react to that, right? So I can say, well, I can start working with that in ways that we can talk about. Well, what do I do with that type of statement? That might be an example of transference. Or, I mean, I'm just thinking of examples as I go along. My client is having that relationship problem with their male partner. I'm a male coach. They sort of make that generalization. Men just don't listen to women, and they have no feelings of their own. That could be a negative transference, but I could reframe it in some way. I could recognize it as this is a projection onto me, generalizing to all men, and somehow challenge that in a soft, resourceful way as the coach. So, as I might say to my client, all men? Really? All men? Do you really think all men? Something like that. Here's an example of countertransference. My client says to me, well, I had some form of trauma in the past. Something really, really bad happened to me. I was in a car accident, let's say, and I was really hurt, and it's terrible. I can't get into a car anymore. I just can't drive anymore because of that trauma. Now, maybe I, as the coach, had a similar experience. I also was in a motor vehicle accident, and now there's the potential that I'm going to be triggered, but there's also the potential that I can be of a resource to the client because I've done the work, so I know what it is like, in a way, to go through that type of trauma. Now, I'm not saying that I would say to the client, well, you know what, I had a similar experience and this is what I did, so this is what you should do. But it sort of creates that extra dimension, intuition, I suppose one might call it, for me to look out for that type of experience. And so by me being triggered, I recognize that with every trigger comes a potential solution. With every trigger comes some wisdom. But I sort of need that insight to be able to recognize that. Shara, does that make any sense to you?
Yes, it makes sense. And it makes me think of other things too. So that was brilliant. Thank you so much, Hennie.
If I may, I can think of another example that potentially addresses your question, Shara.
Yes.
And this being the case where the client's being triggered, and the way in which they describe their issue is that in that situation, in the presence of that person, this emotion gets evoked and they react in this way. And that's what they're presenting as the issue, right? So, like Hennie has said, if we've had similar examples, it's too easy for us to slip into that. And now we're in their story. We've become part of the drama. And our task is to remain the container, to stay in embodied open awareness. And in so doing, to recognize that as the client describes that state, it's just a part of them that has been triggered. The whole person that I'm in this container with, that I'm sharing the space with, is not the person that has been triggered. It's just a part of them that became or becomes triggered in that situation, in that type of scenario. So by holding the awareness that that's just a part of you, dear client, it's not the whole you. I'm here with your whole self. We are transferring energy and information in the health space of the present moment. And we are going to address that part of you. And in so doing, I'm just holding this in my awareness. So my energetic transfer includes the awareness of it's just a part of the client that is speaking about that issue. We can then get into parts work if it feels necessary for the client. And there are various ways to go about that beyond what we're here to talk about today. But just holding the awareness of that's just a part, and maintaining awareness of the whole person that is beyond that part conveys on a subtle level to the client, you are okay. That's just a part of you. And we're going to integrate that part so that it no longer gets triggered in that way. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. It feels to me like you're saying it's a opportunity to kind of learn something more about the client that can actually be used as part of the process of helping them to learn about themselves.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
I think, yeah? Okay.
And not getting pulled into their story. If the client describes something that we can relate to, the temptation to sympathize with them is great. But, oh, I know exactly what that feels
Mm-hmm.
like. I know what you're going through. Poor you. Now what we're transferring is basically keeping them stuck in that mold, seeing the whole person as that limited sense of self. Whereas what I was trying to point to just before is not succumbing to that sympathy, but maintaining empathy in the health space.
So in a way, lots of almost everything that the client shares with us in a coaching session might be an example of resourceful transference. And everything that we do in response might be a type of resourceful countertransference. But maybe we shouldn't use that term, because transference, countertransference seems to have a sort of a negative connotation. Like in when it's not done resourcefully, then we call it countertransference. But in a way, I mean, if you're looking for an example of how exchange of information or energy between client and coach can be resourceful, it's sort of everything else that happens in the coaching space, isn't it? Because there's this continual exchange of information. There's a related concept to this, and I mean, we could keep coming back to this. It's important, and I'm seeing some good comments in the chat window already. But there's a sort of related concept to this energetic transfer, and that's intuition and insight. This fascinates me, as I'm sure it does you. You know, and one is tempted to talk about the science of intuition, which is sort of a little bit of a paradox, isn't it? But it's not really, because like any science, we can think about intuition and we can experience it, and we could, in a way, place it into a framework. We recognize the importance of intuition. As transpersonal coaches, often in a session, we may have moments of sort of insight, intuition. You know, I just sort of have this sense that if I say this, or say nothing for that matter, or this is going to be of service to my clients, to my client. And we often talk about having these intuition, listening to our intuition, which is great. It's a useful tool, but it's not a perfect tool, is it? We bring all our faculties to the coaching space. Yes, we open ourselves to our intuition, but we also analyze our mental faculties, our analytical faculties. We bring that to the coaching space. We bring our training, we bring our frameworks. Everything is relevant. It's not only intuition, but we don't suppress intuition. But now remember, there's also a difference between intuition and insight. And we won't get into this now. Maybe that's a whole topic on its own. It is. But I mean, you know, there's that sort of moment of sensing a solution. And then there's some processing that follows that. A lot of that processing is unconscious. And it comes into our consciousness as a certain defined solution. Remember that processing is subject to things like bias. It's subject to things like our own triggers. And so once again, if we aren't aware of that, then we put a spin or an interpretation on that moment of insight that is perhaps not relevant to the client, but more relevant to me. That's an example of bad ethics, because I haven't respected the space, the autonomy of my client. And so in practice, what does that mean? It means that, yes, when we have those moments of intuition, we check in with our client. So it's sort of an ecology check. You know, it occurs to me, we might say to a client that this and this, what do you think about that? Client might say, yes, absolutely. Wow, I didn't think about that. But the client might say, no, I don't think so. We check in with our client, don't we? It also means that we don't blindly follow our intuition. We might sort of fold it into the session. We might make a suggestion, but then we calibrate, right? Is this working? Has my client responded? What's their body language? What's their energy? What are they saying? And so we use our intuition and our insight responsibly together with all the other tools that we have at our disposal. Look, this is difficult, hey? I mean, this is not simple. but it's why we need to practice it. It's why we need to have an ongoing practice. It's why we need to have supervision sessions, because there is a science to it. It's just that it's a different type of science, and it's not a science that we can read in books. But it doesn't mean we should just ignore it. Maybe some of you have some thoughts around that.
Mary has an interesting observation and question, asking, is there the risk that presence alone can trigger changes or openings that the client, is not ready for?
Well, you might have some thoughts on that, Jovan. Here are my thoughts. Yes. I mean, there's huge potential, that sometimes just by our presence as a coach. This is what holding the space and open awareness is all about, isn't it? Sometimes it's not what we've said or asked. It's simply our presence. I mean, isn't that magic? Presence with a capital P. How beautiful and valuable and meaningful is that? But is there a dark side? Potentially, of course. Each light has a potential dark side, doesn't it? Our clients can be triggered, and very often they are in a session, particularly when you are working with a really deep or sensitive material. This, in fact, flows into what we need to talk about next, which is also our sort of scope of practice, isn't it? So let's use trauma as an example. Thanks, Mary, for introducing that so smoothly. What about if, yes, we're putting all this energy, we're holding the space beautifully, we are allowing our client to process information that they don't ordinarily do. This is the issue. That's why they're here, right? But it's a deep issue. Maybe it's deep-seated trauma that has been hiding in their unconscious. Maybe it's a part that has been in their shadow, and it shows up now and then, and that's why they have the issue, but they've never really recognized it, right? And now they have the opportunity in this space, and it comes out, woof, it comes out in an overwhelming fashion. My client starts having for want of a better word, this is not a very scientific term, a meltdown, right? They have this acute attack of anxiety. Maybe they're visibly upset. They are visibly triggered. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. We can work with that. Maybe this is exactly the moment that transformation will be seeded. But it could be unresourceful. What about if my client goes into a regressive state? That happens. No? Maybe our expanded state of consciousness went slightly too deep, and they have regressed into a previous state in which they were traumatized, and they are revivifying or re-experiencing that trauma. That in the moment is not resourceful. It's a potential important step in our coaching process. But if we leave our clients there, they're going to end their session worse off than they were before. So there are risks, I think. There are risks like re-triggering, revivification. We as coaches need to be ready for that, because it might always happen. What can we do about that? How can we be ready for that? Well, it's good that we talk about it in the first place, but it's important that we are able to recognize certain signs. So if we calibrate to our client, if we can see that there's a change in state, they're becoming more anxious. However, you might intuit or notice that. Maybe it's a body movement. Maybe it's the way that they are talking, their facial expression. Maybe it's just a sense that we have, right? There's a shift. Those are the moments when we really, really need to be alert. We need to be ready, because this is like the moment that things can change one way or the other. So an awareness, again, this requires something like open awareness, an awareness of how our client is potentially being triggered. It also means that we aren't sucked into the narrative. Remember, there are some moments in a coaching space where we as the coach need to take a little bit more charge. And so if our client is obviously triggered in an unresourceful way, I'm going to use that potentially in the rest of the coaching session, but I can't leave them there too long. I need to do something right now that changes their state, that makes them more resourceful, whatever that might be in the moment. So we need to be ready for that. You know, maybe it's something that we say, something that we do to break that pattern. Maybe it is saying nothing and just listening. But we help them to move along. We don't want to leave them too long in that unresourceful state. We want to do something that helps them to use that energy, but we're not going to leave them there. Neither are we going to panic. So panic in the coach would be an example of counter-transference. Oh, my participant is visibly upset. They're having a panic attack. I can't do what now? What have I done? Oh no. Okay. I need to say goodbye now. We'll try again later. You can't do that in a session, can you? Counter-transference would be a sort of a negative reaction to that. A sort of a more positive side would be to that, I'm picking up on my participant's body language. I can actually feel it in my own body. My heart is starting to beat fast because I can see my client has anxiety and it's spilling over into me. You need to be the resourceful one in the space, right? So maybe you need to breathe. Maybe you as the coach need to calm down. Maybe you need to slow things down a bit. Maybe you need to be more resourceful. And that might just be what your client needs in the moment.
This is great and really important. And earlier on in the thread, Jana suggested having a voice anchor. So a word or a phrase that enables the client, when they've become activated in this way, to return to being present. Because if they've become triggered, attention has become narrowly fixated, whether consciously or unconsciously, on the trigger. And that's brought them into, in this instance, a less than resourceful state. By having a voice anchor saying something like, that's fine, just notice what you notice, and delivering that command or suggestion in a compassionate way with a gentle tonality, when repeated throughout the session, becomes an anchor. Each time the client hears it, they return to the state associated with that anchor. This is NLP as it applies in transpersonal coaching, right? So we can utilize other fields, and in fact, NLP has to some extent informed our working model in transpersonal coaching. So using voice anchors in that way. And when we become activated, as Hennie has already suggested, recognizing that first of all, recognizing it as soon as possible, and then bringing ourselves back into a present state. And maybe a voice anchor for yourself, repeated quietly internally as a form of mantra, can be useful. But it's hard to beat the breath in such instances because it's visceral and somatic, and we can really feel the lowering of energy back into the abdominal area, seeping out of the overthinking mind. So the breath is really useful in that way when we breathe consciously. So I'm a fan of returning to that conscious breath, and the anchor that I establish with clients early on in the coaching process is to breathe together. So if something like this happens, this is still in response to Mary's question, we'll take a few breaths together and just explore what's alive and what's present here and how that matters in the momentum of the coaching process. Because I firmly believe nothing arises by accident in the coaching process. So we utilize whatever happens and remain present as we explore what that is.
I think we need to talk a little bit more about scope of practice. We've sort of started to talk about that in the context of trauma, right? We've talked about this before, and it remains important to talk about. Because if you think about it, transpersonal coaching is in a very unique space. In some ways, we are like conventional coaching in the sense that we aim towards performance, but performance in a different context, right? Performance at being a better human being, perhaps one could say. But we are also much closer to other helping professions, like, for example, psychotherapy. And so there might be overlaps between what we do and the type of things that a therapist, psychotherapist, or other types of therapists might be working with. trauma as an example. We can't avoid trauma as transpersonal coaches. We can't. Because of the nature of what we do, trauma is often going to be in the background, right? Many of our clients' issues are probably related to some form of trauma. But it is not within our scope of practice to work with that trauma like a psychotherapist would. We work with the trauma, but there are some differences. For example, coaches, I would say, using trauma as an example and scope of practice, it is not within our scope of practice necessarily to revivify the trauma. We can still work with the effects of the trauma in the present moment. That's what we are good at. That's what we are trained for. And we don't even, think about this, we don't even need to know the details of the trauma in order to help our client work through that trauma. Maybe a psychotherapist would have a different approach. Maybe their approach is perhaps more dissecting the original trauma. I'm putting words in their mouth and I'm generalizing again. But my point is that you need to be comfortable with how we work with a particular topic. We don't do it like another therapist would have done it. We do it like we have been trained to do and what we are comfortable with. There are some other areas that I've noticed where we need to think about scope of practice. For example, psychosomatic symptoms. We often work with clients with psychosomatic symptoms, and we are in a good position to do so. But be wary of physical symptoms that you are missing and that the client is missing that might have real organic pathology, for example. So if you need to refer your client with psychosomatic symptoms to a medical colleague, just to make sure that there isn't something else going on that could be managed in a different way, that's what you need to do. So be familiar with your scope of practice, be familiar what you have been trained for, and don't feel pressurized to do things that you haven't been trained to do or that is outside your area of expertise. You know, and that might be different for each of us because it depends what your background is, it depends what your previous training is. But we sort of proactively have to work out for ourselves what our scope of practice is before we actually get derailed and do something that perhaps we're not competent to do. So scope of practice, I think for us as coaches, really important.
Yes, Hennie, I fully agree. And perhaps just to add a comment there, you know, we can differentiate our way of working from some forms of therapy in that we're very much working with what is present for the client. And even if trauma is evidently there, we're not going to talk about the past. We're not going to regress the client into the past, although they may spontaneously regress into the memory themselves. However, we notice that happening. And as we notice it, we pay attention to what's present in their bodies. And even if there's nothing present in their bodies, which is often the case for traumatized clients, they may be numbing and disassociated from the body, and therefore not able to really connect to the body or the present for that matter. We simply come to that very inability to feel and explore that by remaining as present as possible with that. And one really constructive way to anchor awareness in the present for such clients, in addition to others, is the breath. So we come back to breathing and feeling the sensations of the breath and allow the sensation of the breath felt in the abdominal area in relation to what's just emerged for the client to interplay. So it's anchoring what's emerging in the present moment, and that enables whatever is relevant and ethical, I believe, to come into the foreground of conscious awareness so that it can be expressed by the client. And I believe that that is a helpful and ethical approach for us coaches to work with the heaviest stuff that our coaching orientation may evoke. And it's not evocative as such. We're not going to evoke trauma. But because we help clients to enter into these expanded states of consciousness, it may evoke this material as we've discussed earlier. So not to repeat any of that again, just a reminder. Hennie, over to you.
Yes, these are really useful discussions and really important, and I hope they continue. But before our time runs out, there's one or two other issues that I just want to bring up, and then we can open the floor and hear what others have to say. But I sort of want to shift the focus a little bit to a more, what one might call, a systemic consideration. In other words, what systems need to be in place for us to cultivate good ethics? And here I'm talking about things like our ongoing practice as coaches, and I'm talking about things like supervision. So let's talk about the ongoing practice first. We often recognize this, don't we? We can't coach others if we don't coach ourselves in a way, which means we need to have an ongoing integral practice. It needs to be a practice that's relevant to you. I can't prescribe to you what a best practice is. You need to discover that for yourself. And all of us are on a journey, bearing in mind that that practice might change over time, which is great. But we hold the intent to have some form of practice. It seems to be that an integral practice is often the most resourceful. So it needs to have different elements. We talk about the physical domain and the spiritual domain, emotional domain, interpersonal, transpersonal. But a practice that is easy enough to do, that we can do it consistently and regularly, whatever that might mean for you. But I would almost take that a step further and say that as if you are a practicing coach, an important component of that ongoing practice would be a reflective process. So we bring in our coaching sessions, experiences that we had during the coaching session or after the coaching session. We bring that into our meditation, for example, or we bring that into our practice so that we cultivate this habit of self-reflection, resourceful self-reflection. That's how we learn our style of coaching. That's how we notice our triggers. That's how we notice the things in our shadow that might cause that unresourceful countertransference. But we have to do this continuous work. It starts with us before we can do it for our clients. That's the one thing, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that. The second thing is supervision, and then there's a third point which I would like to talk about, and that's being sort of in an association or a support organization. But the second thing is supervision. What is supervision? Good question. If you look at the literature, there are so many different descriptions of what supervision might be. So I don't have a definitive answer. But traditionally, supervision is when you as a coach, or same would apply to a therapist or any other type of someone in a caring professional relationship, you reflect with peers, often a more senior or experienced peer, but it doesn't need to be. There's an opportunity for you to be in a space with colleagues and peers and receive some, well, guidance and support, I suppose. That traditionally is what supervision might be. I'm purposefully using general terms here because I don't want to limit it to something specific. But you all have an idea of what I mean by supervision. It takes different forms. And there isn't necessarily agreement on what form supervision should take. So some people would say, well, it needs to be one-on-one, and it needs to be with someone who has more experience than you, so that you can be brutally honest with them and they can be brutally honest with you. And you need coaching in a sense if you want to coach others. That might be a valid observation, particularly if you are working through some shadow elements of yourself or some parts. That's important. But others would say, well, maybe a group setting is better. So there's a group of like-minded practitioners who meet regularly, and they have a space in which they can learn new things. So maybe there's some new approach or technique, and that would be the opportunity. Or we refresh an old approach or old technique that you've sort of forgotten about and you needed reminding of, or maybe it's just a space where you can bring examples, you can bring experience, you can bring case scenarios, a supportive environment in which you can reflect on your journey as a coach, and it's a safe space. There's huge value in that. So that would fall under the sort of broad domain of supervision. You aren't on your own. You aren't isolated. You have access to resources. Okay. And a third model of supervision that one might read about is having access to resources, not necessarily live. For example, forums, discussion forums, and that sort of thing. Maybe a combination of all of the above. I would love to hear your thoughts on what you think is effective supervision. And then there's just a last point, okay? And maybe then I'll stop talking and you have some questions. I also think it's important for ethical practice for us to be part of some form of network. There's a challenge we have in transpersonal coaching in the sense that we aren't certified. Well, we are certified, okay, but we aren't licensed. Maybe I should use that word. So in other professional traditions, like a psychotherapist, for example, if you have obtained a certain qualification and you have done certain things so that you have adequate experience, then you are licensed by a professional board. You have to be licensed by a professional board in order to practice. Now, in coaching, all types of coaching, that is not consistently the case. You can call yourself a transpersonal coach without having received any training at all. You can do all sorts of things and call yourself a coach. And it's not illegal. I mean, it's probably not ethical, but it's certainly not illegal. So that's a challenge we have in the coaching paradigm, is this consistency of standards. In the absence of a universally accepted norm or licensing authority, call them what you may, a number of grounds up practitioner networks or organizations have arisen. And the idea being that we can put up some certain minimum standards, we can declare what our values are, and all members of this organization ascribe to those values and those minimum norms. These networks or organizations might perform other functions. They might, for example, disseminate some information to the public, like on their website, for example. And they might have a system of accreditation for coaches who apply to be members according to certain norms or standards that network or organization has. These are all important, I think, for ethical practice, but you tell me what you think. The thing is, though, that I think pragmatically that whatever organization is out there, they need to have certain characteristics. First of all, they need to be transparent, and they need to be open-minded. So if, for example, an association would say, yeah, you can be a member of my association of transpersonal coaches, but then you have to do my training course. Maybe you could have some standards, but it doesn't mean you have to do my training course. If you've done another course and you've complied to those minimum standards, you are welcome if you are subscribed to our values. But also that process needs to be transparent, so that the norms and the values and the way of working of that association needs to be in the public domain. It needs to be transparent. I would say perhaps there needs to be something like a board of directors or something, so that it's transparent and that it's an open, unbiased process. Those are the type of characteristics I would be looking for in a network of practitioners or an association. An example, and obviously I'm biased here, but an example I think that is really relevant to us, of course, is IACTM. Because I think that IACTM does meet all those criteria, but I think that could be a useful platform for things like ongoing supervision, ongoing sharing of materials, ongoing support, which are systemic structures in a way that are in place to support individual ethical practice. Okay. What questions or thoughts does anyone have?
Hennie, thanks for opening up to questions. So this is a great opportunity. You've also offered us opportunities along the way as you've discussed ethics. So I hope people have been waiting to ask questions. Now's your turn. And just to be aware that Hennie is currently working on a paper for an academic publication on this very topic. So Hennie, if there's anything that you might like to gather from the group as we're together today, or perhaps even after the session, that might help to inform or enrich the paper you're currently working on, let us know.
I'm drafting the paper because I really think it's important. You know, I think it's important that we have a sort of a discussion point, a reference out there that is recognizes the unique aspects of ethics and transpersonal coaching. So I'm drafting a paper, but I would love for it to be a broad-based paper. So if you have any suggestions, what you would like to see in a paper on the ethics of transpersonal coaching, perhaps you have some real case scenarios, some examples, then please do let me know. Otherwise, the floor is open for questions, thoughts, comments.
It seems you've covered it all, Hennie.
It's a process. No.
Well, you all here in the live session know how to reach Hennie in any case. So I think questions about this would be welcomed later too. But there in the chat window, Amy, if someone is triggered in a session, do you check with them afterwards by email? Well, I'm sure that would be a nice thing to do, to check in with the client afterwards, how they're doing. But I certainly wouldn't wait until afterwards. As somebody's triggered, I'm trying to calibrate to the client state all the time through my own somatic experience, through what I see, through what I hear. And any of that feedback that I get, whether verbal or non-verbal from the client, would let me know in one form or another if they've been triggered, and in which case we pick that up straight away. You know, don't leave it for, well, there was this thing that remained an elephant in the room, so I'm going to check in with my client after the session because we needed to focus on this other stuff that the client presented. And so this other thing that got triggered, there wasn't time for that. I would rather take the stance of, well, something has been triggered. It's real. It's alive. It's in the space. No elephants allowed in this room. Well, not transparent ones in any case. We want to address that straight away. And I often find those to be really helpful leverage points. And provided there's sufficient rapport with the client, it becomes a meaningful, if not the real reason why the client came for the session in any case. And oftentimes it's no diversion away from the real presenting issue. It's really just how it's being activated in the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's important to maintain that relationship, whether it be by email or whatever other mechanism. But as Johan says, it's important as far as possible to deal with that unresourceful state in session. You don't want your client leaving mid-process, particularly if they were triggered along the way. Yeah. I actually had a question of my own that I would like to pose with the group in a couple of minutes that we still have. So I was speaking to a transpersonal coach just in this week. And she was telling me about a client that, and this is a practicing coach. She's an experienced coach, right? But so the client, it was a new client, and the client said to her, well, yeah, I mean, I have a history of depression. And years ago, I actually hurt myself, right? I attempted suicide. And years ago, I was really had some bad experiences, and I was even hurting myself. So self-harm, right? And so the client then said to her, well, sometimes I still have those thoughts. I can't help it. Sometimes those thoughts just pop into my head. And the coach was asking me, whether I think she should terminate the coaching relationship and rather refer her to someone else because it is inappropriate for her to work with someone who has ideas of self-harm. So what do you think? What would you do?
Yes, I was about to ask you a question about that issue. For example, when a client comes to us with an issue that we are not trained to help, whether we send the client and say, look, this issue, I can refer you to a specialist. However, you are here now. I can help you to integrate some other aspects within you for the session, but I will refer you somewhere else because it's an issue that I'm not trained to help you.
Well, I mean, yeah, thanks for that, Christina. I think that's a good approach, because it's sort of not an either or, is it? It's not. Well, this is the domain of a therapist, and so I'm not going to do anything. I think what Christina is suggesting is a good idea. In other words, you're in the session, and you can be of value and meaning to your client. So you continue the session and you do whatever you need to do. But what you're also suggesting is that when you feel that this is something that is outside of your scope of practice, that maybe you would suggest to your client, in addition, that they need perhaps to refer to someone else who is better trained, who is more within the scope of practice to deal with this particular issue. But you don't just abandon your client. I think this is what Christina is saying. You don't just cut them off and say, no, I'm sorry, but you're actually wasting my time. No, you continue to support them, don't you?
Yes.
So that's a good idea. I mean, yeah. Any other thoughts?
I was just thinking that, this behavior, it's, the root can be in trauma, it's probably in trauma, but I was wondering, as I was kind of reflecting back on this module, how we say that we work with protectors here, kind of referring to IFS, and within protectors, there are managers, but are also firefighters. And what I guess is that this behavior could be the firefighter behavior, because it actually is there to prevent something from happening, or and I was wondering how do we work with those, because they seem kind of more intense, but at the same time, as I guess the general idea about trauma or addiction, for instance, is that addiction, for example, is this behavior to actually deal with the problem. So it would actually, I think it would be something that we could work on session, right?
Yeah, I agree with you, Olga. So and I'm looking at Nikki's point, which is related to what Olga is saying. It might be quite important to reflect on our reaction to self-harm and suicide, as that may influence whether we can stay with it or run. Yes, but also recognizing Olga's point, that our client is coming with so many different parts. The one part might have these ideas about self-harm, but it's not the totality of our client, is it? Maybe the trick, the skill is in deciding how dominant that part is. How strong is this idealization? What is the chances that this client is directly after the session going to harm themselves? If that would be the case, then this is almost like an emergency situation. But look, I've had clients that say to me, there's no meaning, I just want to end it all. But is there intent behind that statement? So it needs to be explored in a way, doesn't it? But yes, Kay, you had your hand up. What do you think?
I don't know if you can hear me. I was playing with this and I think I've wrecked it. Okay. I was just thinking as well, it depends entirely upon the coach as to how triggered they are being themselves. If they feel like they could, really go back into that scenario within themselves, then there's a boundary surely to that as well, maybe.
I think that's a really good point. It's a really good point. If you feel, as the coach, you feel overwhelmed, this is what Kay is suggesting. If you don't feel comfortable, then don't force yourself to continue, because you're not being of service to your client, neither you're being of service to yourself. But what if you're okay? You know, maybe you aren't triggered by what the client has said. Maybe you don't feel out of your depth. But you've reflected on that responsibly. It's not that you're being like a cowboy, you know, I can do this, whatever. Do you think it's okay to continue? Yes, carry on. Yes.
Would it not depend entirely upon each individual circumstance and the person who you're with? So you can't really say as a whole. It would really depend entirely upon the individual circumstance.
I think you're right, Kay. And this is the point that Jules is also making in the chat window. There are numerous factors to consider, aren't there? For example, are they actively self-harming, or in this case, the client said to the coach, I did it years back when I was younger, and somehow through all the years, these thoughts have lingered, but it's been like 10 years before I've actually hurt myself, you know. Or client comes to you and the physical signs are there that they've actually been self-harming, for example. Yeah, there's a difference between how active it is at the moment. I agree with you. And many other factors, you as the coach, you as the client. What other issues do they have? You know, as Jules says, their level of functioning. Some of this might be an intuitive sense, coming back to that sense of intuition we have as a coach. Some of it might be because you've thought about this beforehand, which is why we have discussions like this, so that when you are confronted with those situations, you've done some processing already. I agree with you, Kay. I mean, there's no right or wrong answer here. I would also be careful about reflex reactions, knee-jerk reactions. I think we as coaches have lots to potentially offer clients like that. So it's not either coaching or either therapy, for example. It could be both. And there's plenty of overlap. But it comes down to that awareness that we need to have of all these factors. But there is no one size that fits all, is there?
And yeah, I think you've rounded up nicely there. There's no one size that fits all. So we just need to, as you have suggested, engage in the practice, the supervision, the professional accreditation, stay in contact with peers who do this work, and continue to explore what is best practice.
Joanna, if I may just borrow another 1 or 2 minutes, because Amy has put an important question in the chat window. Are there any psychological diagnoses or warning signs that it definitely wouldn't work with? Again, you know, the word definitely implies it's black and white, which I don't think it is always black and white, but yes, there are certain risk factors that I think we need to be very sensitive to. One of them might be active idolizations of suicide, and we think that there's a high chance that they are going to harm themselves or others. That to me is a sort of a red flag, right? But then also sort of inappropriate idolizations, moving towards something like psychosis. Our clients might have all sorts of visions, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they have pathology. But if they are sort of incoherent in the way that they're expressing this, and if you've spoken to someone with psychosis, you will know what I'm talking about. I think most of the clients that we work with in a coaching space, that probably wouldn't be the case. But if you feel, you know, they're not quite in touch with reality. So in other words, signs of sort of inappropriate visualizations or hallucinations, in a way we might call it, then I would be really careful, and perhaps at the very least, perhaps get the opinion of someone who's better trained at detecting that, like, for example, a therapist. So a couple of warning signs like that. On the physical side, there might be also some warning signs. You know, if your client says to you, well, I'm having these psychosomatic issues, and you know what, I've lost like 20 kilograms in the last 3 months, and I'm really weak, and I'm not eating anymore. Those are also danger signs for a physical condition. Maybe maybe, Amy, you have a good point. Maybe we should, in a way, compile a list, if that's even possible, of risk factors, not absolutes, but perhaps risk factors that we should just look out for, red flags perhaps that we should look out for. Maybe that's a good idea. I'll give that some thinking.
Can I just say something really quick
Yes.
before we go? Yeah, first, this has been brilliant. This has been a wonderful session. There's a really good book, I don't know if anyone's heard of it, called The Ethics of Caring by Kylea Taylor, that talks about a lot of these things. And you mentioned compiling a list, Hennie, a number of really interesting situations that could be ethically challenging. That book includes models for that and those sorts of things. So I just wanted to throw that out there for folks if they're interested. It's really great.
Thank you.
Well, we're over time, so we're going to wrap up at this stage. This is evidently a hot topic and one that we shouldn't move away too far from. So I'd like to wholeheartedly thank Hennie for sharing his knowledge and experience with us on this, taking something that was somewhat more implicit in our working models and making it explicit. So this was the first conversation of this kind where we've actually addressed this topic so explicitly. It seems very relevant. So thank you, Hennie. Thank you all for being here. It's been wonderful to share with you in the space again. And we look forward to seeing you around.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye all.